Eleanor hinted at it a little bit with the kids earlier, but there is a lot that we know about the wise men, right? What are some of the things we know about the wise men?
Probably astrologers.
They're probably astrologers, yeah.
From the east.
From the east.
They came from different places.
Different places.
Traveled a long way.
Traveled a long way. Any other?
By camel.
What's it? Probably by camel, yes.
Brought gifts.
They brought gifts, yeah.
They had faith.
What's that?
They had faith.
They had faith, they did. They had to make that kind of a journey. There is a lot that we know about them. There's very little information we actually have in Scripture about the wise men. We don't know how many there were. We don't know what countries they came from. We don't know what subjects they were studying. All of that those are things that we kind of guess at a little bit along the way. A lot of it, though, is by tradition we know things. Like we have names for all three of the wise men that we have received by tradition. I can't think of what they are right now off the top of my head, except one of them is Balthazar, and I can't remember what the other two are. But we receive those by tradition, and this is something that we do in our faith, where we don't always have all of the bits of the story that we want out of Scripture. We kind of put parts in there to help us tell the story. Doesn't change the meaning of the story, doesn't change the outcome of the story, but helps us to tell the story by adding those bits and pieces in there. Some of that is filled in by work of what we know that folks like them would have done. That's how we know they were probably astrologers, probably also scientists, probably also a wide variety of things that they did back in their time. But we have something that we think we know about them. But there's another big character in the story of the wise men, and we don't often talk about him very much. So let me ask you this question. What do you know about Herod?
He's very self-centered.
Very self-centered, yes.
Obsessed with his death.
Obsessed with his death. I'd forgotten about that one, but yes. What else?
No mercy.
No mercy.
Jealous.
Jealous, yeah. If you have any sort of psychology background, you start listing off all the qualities of a narcissist, he would happily check every single box. That's kind of his role in there. What do you expect out of Herod?
Exactly what he tries to do.
Exactly what he tries to do. Like we expect out of Herod bad things, evil things. We expect him to do that. And we would say that he was evil and probably used some not so nice words to describe him. Words that I would be upset with Jack used. And they wouldn't necessarily be wrong either, because Herod did some truly awful things. He was an awful and generally an evil person, but he was also someone who was kind of hard to pin down about what others of his time thought of him, or what he thought of himself a lot of the time. Herod really wanted to be Jewish. Like, he really wanted to be Jewish, but that's because he was king, and he wanted the legitimacy of being the king in Judea to be Jewish. He wanted that. So he wanted those things. But as we've said, he is also a giant narcissist. And as you can imagine, those things don't always play nicely with one another, right? But here's the big but in this. That doesn't mean that he didn't have some very real worries and concerns. He could have handled them better. And he could have used a whole lot more time watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood growing up than he actually did. It would have made him a better person. But even if he'd been a wonderful, kind, loving person, he would have had some serious problems facing him if he'd heard about these wise men from the east coming into Judea in search of a king. Because Herod, in addition to everything else, was also a pawn to the Roman Empire. They knew, and everyone knew, that he wanted to impress the Romans, because he only ruled because of them. He was appointed a king over Judea, and so he needed to make them happy, but he did as every monarch wants to do, which is he wanted to establish a dynasty. He didn't want it just to be him on the throne, but he wanted his sons and his family after him to rule over Judea. He wanted to be able to claim the Herodian dynasty, not just Herod the king. The difference comes though in how he would have handled things differently had he been a better person. As far as the story of the wise men goes in Matthew's gospel, if he'd been a good person, then he wouldn't have retaliated in such an absolutely horrific way against all of the young boys, hoping that he would have found in the middle of all of that the one who was claiming to be the king. Judea or Israel or Galilee or whatever you want to call it, that area was in a very precarious part of the world. It was important. It was very important, but also it was very fragile. Everything had to be balanced very carefully. I was talking with a friend of mine on the phone this week, and we were trying to think of a good, something that would resonate with us that we would understand comparison to that. Think of Judea, of Israel in that time, kind of like the intersection of 63 and 36 in Macon. Very important to this area. If you go a little bit farther east, you get to the intersection of 36 and 61 over in Hannibal. Another similar sort of crossroads, important kind of crossroad area. But you know, if you've ever been up there, if something happens on the overpass at 36 and 63, you're going to get stuck, right? I've been stuck on both sides of that, both trying to get onto the overpass and both trying to get under it at different points in time. This was kind of the area that they were in. It doesn't take much to back it up, does it? And how many of us have ever gotten caught just trying to make a right turn, even just to get to Dairy Queen in Macon? You still can't make a right turn, right? Why they don't put a stoplight up there, I don't know. But that's the kind of place they were in. Only magnify that, by about 1,000 or 100,000 times. Herod was in charge of this, trying to balance this whole area. But he was not in charge out of heredity, and he was not in charge by will of the people. He was appointed as king by the Roman Senate with the approval of the Roman emperor. And so here's the rundown of how we got there. In 63 BCE, Pompey the Great conquers Jerusalem. Now he leaves in place the Hasmonean king, who would rule under the authority of Rome. Remember, the Hasmoneans were the ones that revolted in the Maccabean revolt in that 400 years of silence that we talked about before we got to Advent. They were the sons of Hasmos who took charge. They were ruling the area. Now they had been conquered by Rome, and they were ruling under that authority. But in about the year 40 to 39 BCE, Herod gets appointed king. I don't know what happened to the other king at that time, but Rome decides they've had enough of that, and they appoint Herod as king. About that time, he marries a woman named Mariamne, who was the niece to the last Hasmonean king. Herod was searching for anything that would give him legitimacy, so he thought marrying this niece would give him some sort of legitimacy as being king over Judea at that time. But finally, in 37 or 36 BCE, Herod conquers Jerusalem, and he names himself king of Judea. And that's where he is. He takes that title for himself. And there ends the Hasmonean dynasty that had been in place for quite a while, and starts the reign of the Herodians. Now that's just what was going on in Judea. In the larger part of Rome at the time, Herod comes to power. We've already heard of Ptolemy the Great. If you remember some of your Roman history class, you're going to recognize the names of like Ptolemy, of Cleopatra, of Mark Antony. He was at a time when we had some of the most famous emperors of the Roman Empire were in power, coming in and out of power of that time. And he fought for them. And he had to keep them happy. But he also had to keep the Jewish authorities that helped to run his own little kingdom happy at the same time. And you all know how that goes, right? If you try to keep everybody happy, what happens? Nobody's happy. Except Herod did a pretty good job of keeping those two groups of people happy. He kept the Romans happy. He, for the most part, even though they didn't necessarily like him, he kept the Jewish authorities happy. But he did that. In any sort of time like that, that means someone is taking all of the brunt of this. And taking the brunt of that at that time were the common people of Judea. But he kept the kingdom together. Herod's response is understandable. His retaliation is horrific. What Herod as a person points to is a very deeply disturbed view of the world. And it didn't have to be that way. And it shouldn't have been that way. But that is how things turn out so very often. From the Magi, from the wise men, we see a different way of handling this. On the one hand, you can look at these wise men as being a bunch of old academic professors that were really excited when they saw something and said, ooh, all of our research we've been doing for all of these years looks like it's going to take shape now. And they get really excited because this prophecy might be coming about, and you think, oh, they're kind of giddy and happy, and they've got tenure, so why do they need to teach classes? They're just going to hop on their camels, and they're going to go and check this out. There are some folks that take that kind of view of the wise men. But it doesn't really work very well. Mostly because of how far they had to go to get there to see the baby. That's a long distance, that's a lot of preparation, and they would have known, because they were well-educated men, that they were traveling into a political minefield. That this is one of the more dangerous places that you could go to in the Roman Empire because of all of these different competing interests that were in places. So you weren't just going to go on an academic curiosity, even one as big as this. But they came to see the baby, and they were delighted to do so. I don't know if they were really delighted or not. That's my own interpretive license I'm taking, because it doesn't really change the story all that much. But I like to think of them that way, that they were excited to be there. They were happy to be there, to go and see that child. So the real question is, what did they know that Herod didn't? Or a better way of asking that is, what should faithful people know that despots and narcissists don't? And the answer is kind of a simple one. And the answer to that is that God has the whole world in his hands. Not us having the world in our hands, but God has it in his hands. It's a very simple answer. Well, it's simple to say. It's much harder to actually live out. But for this purpose, it means that things will change. That they can't help but to change. The question isn't how much can you force them to remain the same, but how do you handle it when things do change? That's the thing that matters. They all saw a baby that would be king. The wise men's response was to embrace the change. They knew they couldn't hold it back. They were students of history. Among other things, if nothing else, they knew current events. They had seen the Roman Empire go from being the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And they had seen emperors rise and fall, even in that short period of time. They were students of history, so they had seen over the previous 400 years all the different folks who had ruled in this area that Herod now claimed as his own kingdom. And they saw what was going on now. They knew that things were changing. Herod's response, on the other hand, was to despise all of this, because he feared that it would take everything that he had from him. He was worried that he would lose all of his powers because of this king that was being born. And he had good reason to be worried, because he had taken power from other folks, and he knew that it could be taken from him. He already experienced it because he'd done it. The thing that he was doing is something we see happen a lot. We watch as people get into positions of power, and then they act as if they have always had that power, and they find ways of legitimizing that. Herod did that by marrying the previous king's niece so he could tie himself to that long history, and he could somehow legitimize his reign as king. And folks begin to act as if they should be treated with great respect because now they've got this new fancy shiny title. They have power now. Now the thing about it is that they didn't always have power, but they act like it in an effort to get folks to buy their propaganda. If you can get them to buy their propaganda, then you can continue to rule and have power. It'll legitimize who they are. But this baby was a threat to that. He was proof that Herod didn't really have any of that power. And so being faithful in a world like this breaks that power that Herod has. It tears down the propaganda that others would put up and to try and legitimize that power. Being faithful recognizes that power is always being given and taken, sometimes politely, sometimes freely, many times though through violence, coercion, or fear. Being faithful knows that power will always act like this when we focus on power. when we try to hold on to the things that were not even entirely ours to begin with, this is a sign that power is in control. Being faithful comes to the baby. Being faithful means we come to the baby that was born and find delight in him. Because in him is true power. In him we can be buffeted by the winds of power around us, but they don't have to control us. In him we can do great things, not because they are powerful, but because they're right and they're good. Not because we despise those that we are taking power from, but because we find delight in God's world and aren't worried about what that power is doing out there. We still have to live in a world where power is the currency that so many are searching for. But we don't have to be broken by it. Being faithful is what keeps us from breaking. Being faithful is subversive to power. And it has the possibility to topple governments. Not because it is strong, but because of the baby that was born. And because some guys from the East came to pay their respects in faith for what was still to come, for the hope of what that child meant.